Hello, and welcome to the Birth Words Podcast, Episode 8, Miscarriage.
You're listening to the Birth Words Podcast. Utah-based birth doula and applied linguistics scholar Sarah Pixton digs into the language of pregnancy and birth to help expectant women claim their power as life-giving agents engaged in a praiseworthy work. This podcast aims to promote positive birth paradigms and is not intended as medical advice.
Hello, welcome to today's episode of the Birth Words Podcast. In the last episode, we touched on a difficult but important subject, infertility. And today we're going to talk about another difficult topic regarding pregnancy and birth, and that is miscarriage. It's another difficult topic that I don't want to shy away from because it's important to be able to have a space to talk about and work through our experiences with these things. So, according to the March of Dimes, 10 to 15% of known pregnancies end in miscarriage, and up to 50% of all pregnancies if you include very early miscarriages before the woman knows that she is pregnant. So, miscarriage is not necessarily uncommon, but all miscarriages are unique, and they're often more painful, both emotionally and physically, than outsiders may realize. For me, I have experienced one very early miscarriage. I only knew that I was pregnant for a few days. And because I had known, though, because my heart had already started to make room for that baby, and because of the medical need to attend to a few things after the miscarriage, it was so difficult. Linguistically, there are many aspects of the experience of miscarriage that could be explored, and I am sure there are many that I haven't yet considered. But from my one personal experience, something that I noticed was that there was sometimes a stark and isolating dichotomy between the clinical language that the medical personnel used and the very intimate personal experience that I was having. So, during my experience with miscarriage, like I said, it was very early. I talked for a few days with my husband in anticipation. We were planning our lives around the estimated due date. We were eager to welcome this baby into our family. These were whispered, private conversations. I only talked with my close family members about it. My mom was in town, and I remember she was leaving to go back home, and she offered her whispered congratulations right before she left town, and minutes later, I realized that I was miscarrying. And the whole tone of my experience of these excited, anticipatory, private conversations changed. My husband and I were on a date that ended with a virtual doctor's office visit, and then I was referred to my OB the next day. I received a Rogram shot because I have a Rh negative blood type. I had an ultrasound to confirm the miscarriage and make sure that nothing was being retained, and suddenly my identity shifted from expectant mother to patient. And in the OB's office, as I waited for my appointment, the door to the back room swung open at one point, and I heard one nurse say to another, "She's a miscarriage." It was said innocently enough, and it was the nurse's way of communicating information about the nature of my appointment, but it stung. So I'm going to zoom in on that experience with an ethnographic lens. Ethnography is the close study of people from the point of view of the subject of the study. And since I'm the subject of this ethnography, it's an autoethnography, a close study of that short personal experience. And I'm going to zoom in a very narrow study of just that experience of sitting in the waiting room, having that overheard conversation of that comment, "She's a miscarriage." And I'm going to just kind of think about why was that so difficult and unpack it. So, Dell Hymes is an influential sociologist. Back in the 70s, he came up with a framework for considering the many factors that are involved in any communicative event, and he used the acronym SPEAKING to consider all the factors. So we're just going to break down each of those factors. Each letter in the acronym stands for a different factor to consider in any communication. So the S stands for setting and scene. The physical setting of this event was the doctor's office, the clinic. I was waiting for an appointment with my OB. I was sitting in a waiting room. The nurses were behind doors that happened to open inopportunely. The S also stands for scene, which Hymes defines as the psychological scene. What is the setting psychologically? And the nurses and I were in two very different psychological scenes. The nurses were at work doing their clinical routine job. They deal with many women in a variety of circumstances, and they were communicating the information that was needed to know how to deal with this situation. I was in a very different psychological scene. I was grieving. I was shocked. I was in hopeful denial. So we were in very, very different spaces. Next, P stands for participants. Again, we've been over this. It was the nurses. They're in work mode. And me, a miscarrying mother, wanting to be anywhere but where I was. And I wasn't actually involved in the conversation, but just I just overheard it. E stands for ends. The end goals that the people in the conversation are working towards. What's the purpose of this interaction? And again, the nurses, their goal, their end was they needed to know the needs of the patients, what was to be done, which care provider needed to see me, which room I needed to be in, how long it was anticipated to take. They were communicating that basic information. For me, I was waiting for an appointment where we would discuss the ultrasound results and if there was any need for assistance in making sure that the miscarriage was complete, even though I wanted anything but for the miscarriage to be complete. The next letter is A, act sequence. That means what happens in an interaction. Go through it step by step. So as I said, I was sitting, waiting to see the doctor. I had just seen the ultrasound tech. I was trying not to cry in a public place. The door swung open and I heard the tiny blip of conversation between nurses. She's a miscarriage. The next letter, K, stands for key. Tone, manner, or spirit in which the act is done. Key. So what key were the nurses operating in? One of the reasons this was so memorably difficult was that we were in totally different keys. The nurse's key was very matter of fact, getting the job done, communicating information. For me, the key that I was operating in, although I was not talking at the time, was of disappointment and grief and trying to hide that and act normal. The next letter, I, stands for instrumentalities. What is the medium of speech and the styles and the registers of speech? As I said, this was a spoken interaction. I talked in episode 4 about discourse with a capital D, the different ways of speaking and behaving that come in different realms of interaction. So the simplest definition of discourse is language in use. And language is used differently depending on where and how it's being used. So you speak differently at home with your family than when giving a presentation at work to your colleagues. And one thing that comes up in birth a lot, I touched on in the infertility episode, and that's certainly part of miscarriage as well, is this issue between this clinical medical discourse that these medical personnel are using because that is their space that they're operating in, and the discourse of a personal, intimate experience. And again, as I referred to before, I had been operating in this very different discourse of this private, intimate experience where my husband and I were quietly, privately talking about, okay, we're planning around this date. When baby comes, what's the plan going to be? And just this eager anticipation. And that the moment of miscarriage changed the discourse that I was involved in as I became a patient in a clinical setting where medical discourse and terminology were used. N stands for norms and interpretation. So what are the norms of communication in these settings? And I just want to touch on, it's totally normal and understandable that the nurses and I were operating in very different spheres. The difference of speech and behavior have logical explanations, but I do think there's room to change the norms in our experiences regarding pregnancy and birth. These very core personal experiences. Although many women see doctors or midwives in a clinical setting, I invite any clinical personnel who are listening, and those of us who use clinical language because it's what we've grown up around and heard, to just consider and remember the very different experiences that these expectant women are having, whether they're miscarrying, experiencing infertility, or giving birth. These are very different realms that they're operating in. And other points during my miscarriage that I'm not focusing on during this autoethnography right now, I did experience this. The ultrasound tech, for instance, was very compassionate and understanding and gave me a safe place to cry and weep. No one in my interactions was intentionally unkind, but I think that in all of our interactions, that there's always more room to be intentionally kind. So the G, the last letter of Hymes' acronym, stands for genre, meaning speech category. And obviously the genre they were operating in, the nurses as they spoke, was spoken prose, interaction between nurses and coworkers in a medical clinic. It was different because I was not part of that speech category. I was not actually part of the conversation. I did not have the same identity as them. I was in a very different place. But I was the subject of the conversation. I was the subject of the statement, "She is a miscarriage." And from their clinical point of view, that was a statement identifying the type of care that I was to receive. We might say she is a first-time mom, or they'd say prima para. She is a 39-week pregnant woman. She is this, but it stung so much to hear myself being called a miscarriage, that this experience that felt so consuming already was somehow becoming my entire identity, that the way in which I was being labeled and communicated about was this traumatic experience that I was going through. So again, I think there's room to be more careful in the words that we use. And this is a lesson outside of birth, outside of miscarriage, outside of infertility, to just recognize the sphere that we're operating in and the language that we're using because we're part of that sphere, recognizing what part of that language doesn't actually align with the beliefs and the underlying messages that we want to communicate, and to consider how we can be thoughtful and compassionate in our language and the labels that we use. And if we are to say she is, he is, what follows? And is that an identity we want to put upon somebody? Or is there another way that that information can be expressed? Again, I do not blame these nurses for having this way of communicating information. It's a challenge that comes up, though, with these clinical settings that deal with very personal experiences, and think that it's something worth considering and thinking about. And I think that as a mother, having gone through that experience, being an expectant mother to this baby, that it's helpful to recognize why this is so difficult. What is inside my realm of control and what is outside of it, and what can I process through to help this feel like an experience that I can move from, learn from, carry with me, and use to do the work that I need to do throughout the rest of my life. So I thank you for listening to this episode. about this difficult topic. I hope that you learned something from peeling back the layers of communication regarding this tiny little zoomed in experience as part of my experience with miscarriage. I am grateful for the medical care that I received, and I don't want to indicate that the nurses were unfeeling, but I do think it's important for those in clinical routine work to pause occasionally and remember that the experiences of those they're serving are anything but clinical and routine. Each person's experience is unique, but I believe that better understanding can lead to better healing. So in closing for this episode, I just want to invite you, if you feel inclined to share a story about miscarriage as a guest, as a pre-recorded story, or a summarized story that I can share, reach out to me at summitbirthutah.com/birthwords. If that feels like a safe and healing thing for you to do, I'd love to be in touch. And we will continue next week digging into the language that surrounds these intimate personal experiences of pregnancy and birth. Thanks. See you next week.
Did words play an important role in your birth experience? If you're interested in sharing your story on the podcast, go to summitbirthutah.com/birthwords. If you're liking what you hear on the podcast, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you choose to listen. For more resources about harnessing the power of words to benefit the birth experience, visit summitbirthutah.com/birthwords.